When a gamer hears the title of a famous game, instinctual thoughts and feelings will surface. This remains true even if they, personally, have not played that game. So for example, when we hear Ocarina of Time, virtually every gamer thinks, well, it's the archetype that all adventure games owe their existence to. When we hear E.T., we think the worst game ever made. When we hear Dark Souls, we think about how it birthed gaming journalism's favorite ad-lib, X is the Dark Souls of Y. As somebody who had not played Ocarina of Time or Dark Souls until a few years ago, I assumed these qualitative assumptions were true beforehand and found out how true they were after. For the past few years, I've been trying to engage with all of the legendary games I missed to understand why these truisms were birthed, and I've gotten through most of them. But there was one glaring blind spot left on my list. I have heard the name Final Fantasy Tactics brought up numerous times by gaming publications, pundits, and podcasts, and every time it was brought up, the person who invoked it said it was in their top 5 favorite games. And apparently, I'm not the only person who has noticed this phenomenon. People speak about this game as if it was delivered from on high, like Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. So while my instinctual assumption about this game whenever I heard about it is that it's so awesome that it defies human language, I didn't know why. In fact, I had avoided it my entire life, for a variety of reasons. I wasn't sure I would like the top-down camera, or how in-depth the combat was. I couldn't get a clear answer about whether I should play the PS1 or the PSP version, and that's just to name a couple. Inevitably though, my list winnowed to the point where I could avoid it no longer. I finally decided to check it out. Okay, hear me out. This game is the Dark Souls of Final Fantasy. Wait! I have a good reason for saying that! Look, when you first played a Souls-type game, you hated it, right? Because it's too hard. But when you learn to play the game by its rules and not impose your will onto it, the level of accomplishment and moral vindication you feel is extreme. It's the same thing with Final Fantasy Tactics. If you can get over the first chapter's difficulty curve, which apparently a lot of people don't, the fun you will have not just engaging in battles, but planning for battles, trying different character builds, and seeing how well the builds mesh together is sublime in the most accurate sense of the word. That said, a great Final Fantasy game doesn't just live and die by its gameplay, but also its story and characters. While it may not have the conceptual depth of FF8, or the philosophical depth of FF9, or the iconic personalities of characters like Cloud, Kefka, or that guy, I have to say, it might have not just the best writing in the entire franchise, but some of the best writing in the gaming medium. While it features many of the common themes from the series, like fate versus free will, questioning authority, learning to deal with grief, these themes are bolstered to staggering heights by 3 key factors. First is its epic scale, reminiscent, even if not equal, to Game of Thrones, a series that, like FF Tactics, was inspired by the same historical event, the War of the Roses. The political intrigue, the various class structures, and mass bloodshed make those previously mentioned themes, and the discussions surrounding them, joyously complex. The second factor is the brevity and wit of the writing. Where many JRPGs can get bogged down in confusing exposition, the amount of information that is conveyed in the game through very short cutscenes and the clarity in which it is done is almost incomparable. Plus, if you play the War of the Lions version, you get a more Shakespearean version of the translation, which turns already great writing into something keenly poetic. But the third and most relevant factor is how these factors combine to create a richly insightful commentary and critique on historically Western values as well as Christianity, one that is cutting without ever being insulting. Today, I want to examine these factors and reflect on how deep Final Fantasy Tactics went with its commentary. Before I do that, I will warn that there are spoilers ahead. If you have not played Final Fantasy Tactics and are inclined to do so without spoilers, make sure to not only bookmark this video and come back to it when you're done, but also refer to the description box to find out the best way you can play this timeless masterpiece. The story of Final Fantasy Tactics and the history of its world span thousands of years across many games, including Final Fantasy XII, Vagrant Story, and many others. For the sake of time and clarity, I'm going to condense everything down to its most relevant parts. Regarding the story of Tactics, there are two events we will focus in on to set things up. First is what is known as the 50 Years' War, fought between Ivalice and the neighboring Eastern Kingdom, Ordalia. This war began when King Devon III of Ordalia suddenly died without naming a successor. The claim to the throne was fought over by King Devon's cousin, Valois VI, and the King of Ivalice, King Dinamda II, who was Devon's uncle. As I said before, the events of this game parallel real-world events, and they are not limited to the subsequent War of the Lions. The 50 Years' War in Tactics mirrors the 100 Years' War between England and France. The analog to Ivalice's King Dinamda would be Edward III. He made a claim to the French throne after King Charles IV died, and was meant to be succeeded by his cousin Philip, Count of Valois, whose obvious parallel would be the aforementioned Valois VI in Tactics. I see what you did there, Japanese translators switching the R and the L. Ultimately, the 50 Years' War was a virtual stalemate until both sides agreed to terminate their fighting. They did this so they could turn inward and address domestic issues, like their economy, deadly plagues, and peasant uprisings. Unfortunately for the denizens of Ivalice, they would not be able to celebrate this reprieve for long. After 50 years had passed, Ivalice's regent had been replaced multiple times, culminating in the official rule of King Andoria III. Although due to being weak and unfit to rule, all of his decisions were made by Queen Louveria. Louveria's rule was heavily disliked by nobles and peasants alike. Her primary affront was her desire to make her newborn son, Prince Orinus, the successor to the Ivalician throne. Ivalice's Council of Nobles disagreed with this, wishing to appoint Duke Gultana of the Black Lion Crest to claim the throne. Duke Larg of the White Lion Crest, however, wished to see Orinus take the throne so he could enact his will through Orinus as an advisor. This set the stage for the central conflict of Tactics, the Ivalician Civil War, known as the War of the Lions, whose real-life analog, as I said before, was the War of the Roses, fought between House Lancaster of the Red Rose, and House York of the White Rose. The beginning of Final Fantasy Tactics takes place shortly before this war. Though there are multiple characters introduced right out of the gate, again, I will condense everything to maintain clarity. The two most important characters of Final Fantasy Tactics are easily Ramza and Delita. Ramza is a nobleman of House Beolve. Delita is a commoner who was adopted into House Beolve as a child by Ramza's father, Barmanath. Both of them grew up attending a military academy so they could one day serve in Duke Larg's White Lion Army, known as the Order of the Northern Sky. Chapter 1 of the story features Ramza and Delita attempting to quell an uprising led by a revolutionary group known as the Corpse Brigade, who wished to overthrow the nobility, including their master, Duke Larg. Though their efforts to track down members of the Corpse Brigade and stop them are generally successful, Ramza and Delita contend with surmounting moral problems that bring their allegiances into question. One of the first of these moral problems emerge when the White Lion Army capture a member of the Corpse Brigade, who makes a very cogent point about the class divide in Ivalice. He says that after the 50 Years' War, the peasants that fought were not paid for their service, and were left to languish in poverty, while nobles like Ramza bore no economic burden. The validity of this point is exacerbated by characters like Argoth, a fellow noble whom Delita and Ramza rescue from the Corpse Brigade. He views anybody not of noble birth to, virtually, be of lower inherent value, and directs much of his ire towards Delita, who was born a commoner. As more moral conundrums like this pop up, a class-based tension begins to emerge between these lifelong friends, culminating in what is probably the best and most shocking part of the game. In retaliation against the Order of the Northern Sky, the Corpse Brigade kidnap Delita's sister, Titra, and hold her for ransom. In their efforts to try and rescue her, Ramza and Delita encounter the leader of the Corpse Brigade, Wygraf, whom they battle and eventually weaken. Before Wygraf retreats, he reveals that he and the Corpse Brigade are not the villains Ramza has been made to believe. Rather, Duke Larg, along with Ramza's brothers, Dystarg and Zalbag, have inserted double agents to sabotage the brigade's public perception. This includes the double agent Gustav, who kidnapped a nobleman named Marquis Elmdor at the beginning of the game. Wygraf also reveals that Titra's kidnapping was not sanctioned by him, but was a desperate move made by a soldier named Gragoroth. This becomes all but confirmed when Ramza and Delita find Gragoroth holding Titra as a human shield at a Corpse Brigade hideout. Argoth aims his crossbow at Titra and Gragoroth, and despite Ramza and Delita's protestations, Ramza's brother Zalbag orders Argoth to fire, killing Titra in the process. Following this, a tense battle of arms and an emotional battle of wits breaks out. Argoth proclaims that if Delita and Titra had embraced their fate as lowly commoners, had they mongered flowers on some street corner, that they would have never found themselves in this mess and Titra would still be alive. This drives Delita into such a rage that he not only threatens Argoth's life, but Ramza for his nobility as well. Though Argoth is ultimately struck down, the confrontation between Ramza and Delita is halted when the Corpse Brigade hideout, laden with gunpowder, explodes, causing Ramza to be knocked out. When he awakens, he sees that Delita is nowhere to be found, and surmises that he must have died in the explosion. In despair, Ramza treads into the icy wilderness. Before I continue, I wish to highlight a theme that has already popped up and will continue to pop up until the end. Every faction in the game will frame themselves as the good guys. The reality is that every faction puts up a moral front to conceal their true motivation, which is to grasp power. This remains equally true for the Black Lions, who, as we see during the actual War of the Lions, are willing to prolong the civil war no matter the expense, just so they can gain the throne. In this scenario, the question to be asked is whether or not one can uphold a moral code when all the institutions are corrupt, and all the odds are stacked against you. For some, the answer would be to turn to a higher power for guidance, to seek God through the Church. But what if even the Church is not exempt from this lust for power? After Titra's death and Delita's presumed death, Ramza eschews his nobility and becomes a freelance mercenary, working for a man named Gafgarian. His current mission is to protect Princess Ovelia, a woman who has a legitimate claim to the throne due to being a daughter of former King Dinamda IV of Ivalice. At one point, an army of soldiers bearing the Black Lion crest of the Southern Sky show up to kill Ovelia. After this fight, Delita resurfaces and kidnaps Ovelia for unknown reasons, compelling Ramza and his fellow band of mercenaries to give chase. They later corner Delita and Ovelia at a waterfall, only to see them also cornered by a band of Northern Sky Knights. At this point, a series of shocking revelations are made. It is all but officially revealed that Ramza's brother Dystarg not only ordered Gafgarian to kidnap and execute Ovelia, he also dressed up his own soldiers as Southern Sky Knights during the previous battle, in order to frame Duke Goltana. Despite the shock of this revelation, Delita, Ramza, and Ovelia's personal knight Agrias managed to defeat Gafgarian and the Northern Knights. Unfortunately for Ramza, he is not able to reconcile with his former brother figure. Thankfully though, Delita does not make good on his former murderous promise to Ramza. Instead, he suggests that Ramza and Agrias take Ovelia to the nearby church, a supposedly neutral entity. Though the cardinal of the church offers refuge initially, Ramza slowly uncovers a secret, nefarious plot by the church. The church intends to instigate the War of the Lions, to encourage Duke Larg and Duke Goltana to weaken each other through war, so the church could fill the power vacuum, which they would do by installing Ovelia as a puppet ruler. The church would then ensure that their rule would be virtually eternal by collecting a series of 12 magical artifacts known as Zodiac Stones, stones that would grant them unlimited power. And as we clearly see, the church is willing to do anything, including murder, to achieve this end. So when the church and both lion factions are corrupt, what should one do to replace this political order? More importantly, what can one do that is realistic and reasonable while also adhering to moral standards? The difficulty of that question is explored through Ramza and Delita's separate journeys. Now, while Ramza is obviously the moral hero of the story, I don't think it's controversial to say that Delita is easily the more interesting and well-written character. I'll go even further. In my years of analyzing games with great stories, Delita might be one of the top 10 best-written characters I've ever encountered in the gaming medium. This is because, in short, Ramza's response to the corruption of the church and the lions represents a high ideal that few could ever embody. Delita's response, however, is probably the most human, the closest to how we would respond if we were in his shoes. Though Delita's actions to take down the established order do cross over into the realm of villainy towards the end, specifically with his consequentialism and ends justify the means attitude, it is impossible to not sympathize. One point in favor of Delita's methods is established early on in the game when Tietra is kidnapped by the Corpse Brigade. Ramza tries to comfort him by naively saying that if he endeavors it, if he wills it, he can save Tietra. Delita, however, angrily responds by asking Ramza if Endeavor will grant him an army. Given Delita's commoner status and the nature of warfare, it is clear that not only will Delita not receive an army, but that his sister would almost certainly die, a prediction that, as we saw, came true. Combining his grief with his comparatively less naive perspective and lack of resources, it makes perfect sense that Delita would try to outsmart a treacherous system by trying to employ his own treachery with an ideally better end. The question, however, is whether Delita's ends always justify his means, which, as I said a moment ago, is a fine line that Delita treads for most of the game, until he succumbs to villainy. At first, he works as a double agent for the church, because their common interest is to use Ovelia to institute a new political order. When the church kidnaps Ovelia after Ramza sought them for protection, Delita then subverts the church, kidnapping her again so he can bring her to Duke Goltana of the Black Lions. Although he is careful to cover his tracks so that the church cannot trace her kidnapping back to him. He brings Ovelia to Goltana so he can ensure a high-ranking position in the Black Lions army. By getting close to Goltana, he can carry out both his and the church's wish of not just assassinating Goltana, but also his chief advisor, Cid. And here's where Delita's actions can truly begin to be categorized as evil. Delita wishes to escape culpability for Goltana's murder by framing Cid as the murderer right before Delita kills both. However, Delita is unwilling to kill Cid, because Cid had demonstrated his lack of fealty to Goltana and a strong moral compass in many scenes throughout the game. So, Delita decides to use a body double, a devout of the church, to be executed in Cid's place. Granted, though the church and its followers are corrupt religious zealots, it is not obvious that this body double is conscious of the church's corruption, nor is there any evidence that he personally has committed any crime. So for Delita to sacrifice an innocent person to protect his status and ensure the creation of his new kingdom is reprehensible and is deserving of the utmost condemnation and punishment. The problem, however, is that I fail to see how most people wouldn't do the same as Delita. When the only morality that exists in this corrupt world is one based on power, Delita's actions are minuscule compared to those of the Lions and the Church. Moreover, despite Delita's heinous acts and his increasing antagonism to anybody that would get in his way, the opening section of the game clearly shows that history views Delita as a hero who led Evilise out of this dark period. It should also be noted that it isn't uncommon for political figures in real life to be revered for their major positive accomplishments, while the historical record also shows that they are responsible for unspeakable acts. So there is an argument to be made that even though we condemn consequentialist morality on a personal level, many will justify it in times of war and strife. And history does often take a consequentialist view of a famous figure's life. But with all this said, the pursuit of a noble end through questionable means will always result in unintended consequences, including, but not limited to, the corruption of one's soul. And as we will see, it is Ramza's pursuit of morality and justice that is the one that is ultimately vindicated. If Delita's morality is consequentialist, Ramza's morality is deontological. To put it simply, where Delita believes his ends justify his means, Ramza justifies his means before pursuing any end. To make sure his means are the best, he grounds himself in an ethic that prioritizes truth and rewards those who wish to do good, wherever he may find it. I believe that his ethic is, in part, informed by the ethic of the game's writer and lead designer, Yasumi Matsuno, one that seems to be grounded in Eastern philosophy and acts as a sort of response to Western philosophy and culture. In short, where Western culture and religion relies on looking outward for moral guidance to God and the Church, Eastern culture and religion looks inward, at one's individual self as the source of their salvation. One Eastern religion that preaches this is Taoism, which says that you must walk the straight and narrow path between chaos and order to lead the most moral life. I think the game subtly hints at this with its choice of color scheme for the Lions. Why was it changed from the red and white of the Rose War to the black and white of the Lion War? I believe this was Matsuno's subtle commentary on the Western tendency to associate everything good with white and order, and everything bad with black and chaos. In the East, black and white, chaos and order, are morally neutral symbols. Both contain just as much good as they do evil. By recognizing this, one can rally the good that is within both and eschew the evil. And we see Ramza do just that. He stops seeing his White Lion banner as representatives of pure good, and instead begins to see how similar they are to all the other factions. Though all the factions are corrupt, he finds and nurtures people within that are willing to do good. With the Black Lions, he works with people like Sid and Orin. With the White Lions, he tries to appeal to the good in Zalbag. With the Church, he works with Elder Simon. Instead of giving into feelings of resentment like Delita does, wanting to burn the whole system down even if it means losing good people in the process, Ramza takes the more difficult yet more moral path of contending with the system to seek out and preserve the good. In doing so, he sets a better moral example than that of the Church, better than even the deity that they worship. There's another element to Matsuno's personal philosophy that seems to be on display here, one which anybody with a knowledge of Christianity will find about as subtle as a bottle breaking over their head. The Church of Glabados in Final Fantasy Tactics is clearly an analog to the Catholic Church, with blatant references to major events in the life of Jesus Christ. Saint Ajora, the deity that the church worships, was betrayed by a disciple named Germanique, which is analogous to Jesus Christ's betrayal of his disciple Judas. Christ was crucified on the hill of Golgotha, while Ajora died at a place called Golgolada. Like, really? You created all these overly complicated names for all the other locations and characters, and you couldn't bother to make it okay. Anyway, with this allusion to Christianity, Matsuno critiques the social and religious structure that the West lived under at the time. The monarchies that were built up, from the time of the Egyptians to the time of Christ, all the way to the Middle Ages, were based on an assumption that the king or queen derives their authority from God, what some have referred to as the divine right of kings. However, as wars like the War of the Roses or the War of the Lions demonstrate, this assumption can be taken advantage of by imperfect humans with ill intent. This fact necessitates skepticism, not just towards the monarchical system, but also to the church, as Final Fantasy Tactics clearly advocates. One thing that the Church of Glabados is desperate to cover up is the fact that Saint Ajora was not a divine being like Jesus Christ, but a mortal revolutionary. Though make no mistake, Matsuno is not suggesting that this is the case with the real-life Christian Church or the historical Jesus Christ. What he is simply suggesting is to prioritize truth over blind faith, regardless of whether the truth is found in religion or elsewhere. Though the truth can sometimes be unbearable, like uncovering information that casts doubt on your faith, as Ramza does regarding the church, it is those who choose to live in harmony with that truth regardless that are the most moral. The only question that remains is whether or not doing what is best for oneself will, in turn, produce the greatest good for everybody. At the ending of the game, both Delita and Ramza succeed in defeating the evil system that controlled Ivalice. Delita becomes king and Ovilia becomes queen, while Ramza's fate remained uncertain following the climactic battle. Though it seems like Delita is about to get his happy ending despite his misdeeds, he suffers a shocking turn of events. Ovilia breaks down, uncertain if she can ever trust Delita after all the terrible things he did to bring down the system. And in a moment of distress, she stabs Delita, compelling him to stab her back. As he falls to his knees, he looks up at the sky and wonders out loud whether Ramza got what he was looking for. Though Delita would go down in history as a hero, just as Saint Ajora went down in history as a divine being, it is unknown whether Ramza would receive the reverence he deserved. For a time, the church did everything it could to suppress what Ramza did. It wasn't until decades afterward that a character named Razlam would bring the truth to light, as we see in the game's opening prologue. Will that revelation see Ramza vindicated in the public eye, to have his morality seen as superior and Delita's deeds exposed? Or will the public ignore this information, and let he who lived in truth be obscured in favor of the official truth? I suppose the only way one will ever find out if truth wins in the end, be it with the game or in real life, is, ironically, to have faith.